My mother was the kindest woman in the village, but everyone thought she was a witch. I didn't know that, of course. I was just a child. All I knew was that strange things kept happening, and no one could explain them. One night, when I was around 10, I woke up to a loud banging sound. Our front door was shuddering, like someone was trying to break it down. I lay there, holding my breath, heart pounding. The banging stopped suddenly, and then there was silence. But just as I started to calm down, I heard voices. They were whispering, chanting. I couldn't understand the words, but the sound sent chills down my spine. It was like the shadows themselves were speaking. The door creaked open, and I saw my mother standing there, her shadow stretching into my room. She was holding a bowl of water, her face half hidden in the darkness. She stepped inside, and her voice was calm, almost soothing. She told me not to worry, that everything would be all right. But the next day, I heard the whispers around the village. They said my mother had been seen outside in the dead of night, pouring water on the ground and murmuring to herself. They said the ground had turned black where the water fell. That the crops in our village started dying after that night, and the river we all drank from had turned murky and thick. It didn't make any sense to me. My mother was the one who nursed people when they were sick, who knew the right herbs to stop a fever or heal a wound. I'd seen her stay up nights to care for our neighbors when the sickness came. But the whispers wouldn't stop. They grew louder, and soon, people were afraid of her. One evening, I asked her about it. I still remember how her face looked in the dim light of the oil lamp. Sad, tired, but also determined. She told me that some things in this world are beyond us, that there are spirits who speak in ways we can't hear. She said she had done nothing wrong, but there were rituals, things she had learned from her mother, ways to protect our family that others wouldn't understand. Then, something strange happened. Chickens in the village started disappearing. Goats too. Just gone without a trace. People whispered that my mother was using them for something dark, that she was sacrificing them in the dead of night. I didn't believe it. But it was hard to ignore how people looked at her, how they pulled their children close when she walked by. The turning point came on the night of the storm. A heavy, angry rain had been falling for hours, and there was thunder so loud it shook the walls. In the middle of it, there was a fire, a huge fire that started at one edge of the village and spread fast, fueled by the dry grass roofs. People ran outside, screaming, trying to put it out, but the wind was too strong. It was like the storm itself wanted to consume us. I was terrified, huddled in a corner of our hut, watching as the flames crept closer and closer. Then my mother did something that still chills me to remember. She grabbed the knife, went outside, and cut her palm. Blood trickled down her fingers as she whispered something, words I couldn't hear over the storm. Then she lifted her hand to the sky, and just like that, the rain stopped, the fire went out. Silence fell over the village. It was like the storm had never been there. The next morning, everyone avoided us. They said my mother had called the fire and then put it out herself. They said she had sacrificed her own blood to make a pact with spirits, that she was responsible for every bad thing that had happened. My father tried to defend her, but the men of the village had made up their minds. They gathered outside our hut that evening, their faces lit by torchlight, angry and afraid. They told us to leave and never come back. We packed our things that night. I remember looking at my mother, her face in shadow, and wondering what she was hiding from me. I still don't know if she had power, or if she was just a woman who knew things that frightened people. But as we left, I looked back and saw the village elder. He was watching us go, with something like regret in his eyes. Years have passed since then, but I still dream of that night. I still see her lifting her bloody hand to the sky, and I still wonder if maybe, just maybe, they were right about her. Or if she was simply the good mother they couldn't understand. After we left, my life changed completely. We moved to a smaller village, far from the whispers and judging eyes. But the memory stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I kept replaying that night, trying to remember every detail, hoping to find something, some answer. My mother never spoke about it again. She went back to her usual self, caring for people, helping them heal, and teaching me little things about herbs and remedies. But she always seemed a little sadder, quieter. Her laughter didn't come as easily, and she started looking over her shoulder, like she was waiting for something to find us again. One day, about a year after we left, something strange happened. A woman from our new village came to our door. She looked worn and desperate, carrying a child with a terrible fever. The child was shaking, barely breathing, and no one else had been able to help. My mother immediately took the child inside, laying him on our small mat and covering him with cloth soaked in some bitter-smelling concoction. The woman sat beside me, her eyes darting around the room as if she was afraid to be seen there. I heard her whispering under her breath, something like, "Please, don't let it be true." My mother worked silently, her hands moving in a practiced rhythm. She murmured words I didn't understand, her face intense and focused. After a few hours, the child's fever broke. He started breathing easier, his body stopped shaking, and color returned to his face. The woman left without a word. She barely looked at my mother, as if seeing her would make the whole thing real. That night, I overheard some of the villagers talking. They said the woman's child had been touched by a spirit, and that only a witch could break such a curse. They were talking about my mother. Even here, far from our old home, the rumors had started to grow. I thought about confronting her, demanding the truth. But every time I looked at her, saw her kindness, I stopped myself. It was easier to believe that she was just misunderstood, that she was simply a healer in a world full of superstitions and fear. But there was one final incident that changed everything. One evening, a group of men from the village came to our door. They were polite but firm, saying they needed my mother's help. Apparently, a boy had gone missing in the nearby woods, and they wanted my mother to help find him. She nodded, grabbed her basket of herbs and small charms, and we followed them into the dense forest. The air was thick and quiet, and every shadow felt like it was hiding something. We searched for hours, and the men grew restless, whispering among themselves. Some of them kept glancing at my mother, suspicion in their eyes. Finally, she stopped. She knelt down, touching the ground gently, as if she was listening to it. She then walked a few steps and repeated the action. The men watched her, some of them visibly uncomfortable, muttering under their breath. Then she spoke, her voice soft but certain. "He's near the stream, under the fallen tree." The men exchanged looks, skeptical but desperate. They led us to the stream, and sure enough, there was the boy, cold and frightened, but alive. His parents hugged him, thanking my mother over and over, but the rest of the men stood back, whispering. Later that night, they returned. This time, they weren't asking for help. They said my mother must have put the boy in the forest herself, that she must have lured him there to make it look like she'd found him. They accused her of using dark powers to manipulate them, to gain their trust. I was horrified. I wanted to defend her, to tell them they were wrong. But then I looked at her, standing there calmly, a strange resignation in her eyes. She didn't argue. She didn't try to explain herself. Instead, she turned to me, and in a low voice, she said, "It's time to go." We left that night, and we never looked back. To this day, I don't know if she was what they thought she was. Sometimes, I wonder if she really had a connection to something beyond us, something dark and ancient. Other times, I think she was just a healer who knew too much, who scared people with her knowledge and her strength. But there's one thing I know for certain. My mother was a good woman. She was my protector, my guide, my everything. And whatever she was, or wasn't, I loved her. But even now, late at night, when I wake up to the sound of whispers in the dark, I wonder if maybe, just maybe, they were right to be afraid. Years passed, and my mother grew older. We moved from village to village, never staying in one place for too long. She kept to herself, helping those who came to her but never seeking attention. And as I grew up, I learned her ways, her knowledge of plants, of roots and herbs, of the strange patterns she seemed to see in nature that others didn't. She taught me in whispers, late at night, warning me to keep our secrets hidden. But there was always a shadow hanging over us. People would glance at us, cross to the other side of the road, and whisper about the healer who wandered. No matter where we went, rumors always seemed to follow. My mother tried to keep her head down, but it was like something unseen always called her back to the edge of people's fears. Then, one fateful day, a new rumor started spreading. A young girl from our latest village had fallen ill. She'd been perfectly healthy, playing with her friends one day, but by nightfall, she was feverish, her skin pale and her body weak. No one knew what was wrong. Doctors couldn't help. Her family was desperate, and word spread that she was on the brink of death. The villagers grew nervous, and whispers quickly turned toward us. People remembered the strange herbs my mother gathered, the way she seemed to know things that others didn't. Some said she must have cursed the girl, that she'd taken something from her to stay alive as she aged. They claimed her years of wandering were punishment, that the spirits wouldn't let her settle because of something dark she'd done long ago. The villagers didn't waste any time. A mob gathered outside our home, demanding that my mother remove the curse. They shouted that if the girl died, my mother would pay. I saw the terror in their eyes, and I knew they believed every word they were saying. My mother stepped outside, her face calm but weary. She told them she hadn't cursed anyone, that she didn't know what was making the girl sick. But they wouldn't listen. One of the men threw a stone at her, and I watched in horror as it hit her shoulder, leaving a deep bruise. She turned to me and whispered, "Stay inside." But I was too afraid to leave her side. I didn't want to lose her, not to them, not to fear. Finally, she agreed to try and help the girl. She went back inside and mixed a potion, something dark and bitter, and told me to take it to the girl's mother. I ran through the crowd, clutching the bottle, praying it would work. The girl's family accepted the remedy with a mixture of desperation and suspicion, and her mother poured the liquid into her mouth, one drop at a time. I waited outside, holding my breath, hoping against hope that she would get better. Hours passed, and as dawn broke, a cry rang out from the girl's house. Her fever had broken. She was awake, weak but alive. The crowd murmured, and for a moment, I thought the worst was over. But instead of relief, they were filled with more fear. They said my mother had saved the girl because she had no choice, that the spirits were forcing her hand, that she was only keeping the curse at bay until it could find another host. They didn't thank her. Instead, they looked at her with even more hatred. That night, the elders came to our home with a warning. They told us that we weren't welcome in the village anymore, that if we didn't leave by morning, they would force us out. They said my mother's powers were too dangerous, too unknown, and they couldn't risk having her around. I begged her to stay, to explain herself, to make them understand. But she only shook her head and told me we had no choice. So we left. Again. As we walked down the empty path away from the village, the morning mist curling around our feet, I felt something break inside me. I was angry. Angry at them, angry at my mother for being so calm, and even angry at myself for not understanding. For not knowing who she really was, or what she really carried with her. We traveled in silence for a long time. Finally, I gathered the courage to ask her, "Mama, are they right? Are you really what they say you are?" She stopped walking, looking down at the ground as if weighing her answer. Then, she placed her hand on my shoulder, her eyes sad but filled with a quiet strength. "I am what I need to be to protect you," she said softly. "And to protect the people I love, even if they don't understand. Even if they hate me for it." That was the last time I asked her. I didn't need to know anymore. Whatever she was my mother. She had saved lives, even those who wished her harm, and she had taught me that sometimes, people will fear what they don't understand. Years later, after she passed away, I found myself in a village that had its own healer, a young woman, struggling with the same whispers, the same doubts. And in that moment, I knew what I had to do. I stayed. I taught her everything my mother had taught me, and I became the protector my mother had been. I lived with the whispers, the suspicious glances, and the rumors. And somehow, I found peace in it. Because I finally understood. The good mother doesn't need to be understood. She just needs to be strong enough to bear it. In the end, the biggest lesson I learned from my mother was that strength isn't about fighting fear, it's about standing firm in the face of it. People will always fear what they can't explain, and sometimes, even kindness is mistaken for something dark. But she taught me that true goodness doesn't need recognition or approval. It only needs purpose. I learned that to live with purpose is to accept the weight that comes with it. My mother knew that her role was to help others, even if it meant facing their distrust. She accepted it, knowing her actions would outlast the whispers and rumors. From her, I learned that the good we do speaks for itself in the end, even if no one else sees it. And maybe the greatest lesson of all was this: sometimes, love is silent and hidden, a strength that waits in the shadows and endures without applause. The good mother may walk alone, may be misunderstood and cast aside, but she carries on. She knows that even if the world fears her, her heart knows the truth. In her quiet way, she taught me that love is strongest in its sacrifice, and that there is no greater gift than to live not for praise but for purpose. In the end, my mother's legacy was not just in her healing, but in her courage to be what others could not understand, and her strength to carry that burden without bitterness. And that's what I hold on to. That's the true legacy of a good mother.